Hello, we are here at Voices of Practice to give voice to mental health practitioners and their lived experience of their work, to highlight different therapeutic approaches and emerging themes in practice, especially in Asia. And we are here today from Singapore with Julie Goldstein. Thank you for being here, Julie.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
So am I. I'm so interested to hear a lot more about your work. Julie, you have a space called Meaning Makers, and it is a safe space to make meaning and to be human. That's the tagline. I feel like it's such
Mhm.
a profound tagline for your practice. What experiences or influences shaped how you work with clients in Meaning Makers today?
A few things. My very early work in psychology and my early research during my doctorate years. I did a lot of cognitive anthropology, psycholinguistics. I studied cross-cultural differences between different peoples, and my interest in the differences in people and how things emerge within them. And it then moved into wanting to interact a bit more because initially I was a researcher and I did very controlled experiments and so on. And I got interested in clinical work and I trained as a Gestalt therapist. And from there on, practiced Gestalt therapy. So I think that transition was particularly important. And and yeah, maybe I'll stop here.
And are there particular client themes or life stages you feel especially connected to as you're practicing?
Hmm. So I think my interests have varied across the years. I initially, when I came to Singapore, I want to say I was very interested in family planning and fertility. And so I sort of became a bit of a specialist in that area. And I would see a lot of families, couples, and individuals who were sort of planning to grow their family, essentially. And my interest then shifted to a lot of couple work. And so that remains a strong focus in my practice. And I think that underlying everything, I have always been interested in addictions, whether it's the initial addiction, the cross addiction, how addictions work in families, because there's a systemic kind of relational aspect that happens. And so that's always been with me. And actually, my first client, who's still with me today, in and out of practice, but we're still in touch, she had cigarette bud addiction plus other cross addictions. And I know that she wouldn't mind me saying as much today. And, and so I think that this thread of my work has always been there.
I see. Thank you. It's quite a diverse practice. And Julie, you identify yourself as a humanistic therapist. What do you think people misunderstand most about Gestalt therapy? Or rather, what do people understand about Gestalt therapy that you have perceived? It's like a fairly novel thing in Singapore, I imagine.
I like your question, Iffa, because I think it's an important question because Gestalt therapy isn't practiced in the mainstream kind of how psychotherapy is practiced. And so I think it's important to answer that question. I'm just thinking about what I want to say about that. How would I define Gestalt therapy? What I think is important to understand about Gestalt therapy in general is that it's a therapy that embraces the individual in the environment and in a social context. And so it's a very relational therapy. And I often like people to understand this at the beginning of their therapy. And so I will often give them the metaphor of going on a hike up a mountain. And if we're doing this together, we of course kind of like trace our route a little bit, but we also learn to equip ourselves. So we might need water, towel, the proper shoes on, the sunscreen, the hat, if it's hot, yeah, and everything else. And so when we start to hike together, we do a lot of prep work. When we start to hike, We probably take turns. We are sometimes next to each other, but actually one of us may be leading, either the client or me, or depending on who's in the room. And then we might take breaks and pauses. And, sometimes we'll stop at a refuge, or we'll kind of do a detour, and we might come back to the road. And we think we're working towards the summit, but often we might need to work towards the right of it, the left of it, or even stop somewhere else altogether.
Mm.
And so it's experiential, and we work it out as we go.
That's such a beautiful metaphor for that. And I like the idea that at any point in time, different people would be leading, and depending on who else is in the room, that would also be part of the process. Because there's a more popularized idea of Gestalt where there's an empty chair, and whoever, I imagine that whoever who sits in the chair will also be at one point leading.
It can be transgenerational work,
Mm.
often, and we can work with unfinished business, and so we can bring others into the
Mm.
room. Yes.
That sounds extremely powerful. I mean, on this note, what would you want potential clients to understand before starting therapy with you?
So the way I work is that I have essentially contractual agreements with my clients. And of course, there is kind of like a base from which I work, which I will tell clients about, because it's about keeping us all safe within a
Mhm.
framework. Okay. And then we tweak it. So we form an agreement that is relational, depending on what the client's needs are. What I'd like clients to understand as well, I suppose, is that ethics matter in this work. Like deep respect matters, ethics matter, and to work ethically and to work soundly, to get people to feel safe and to be able to co-create is very important. And so I think that I've always been pretty firm, on
Mhm.
some of these things. And and I think that today this shows by way of being accredited, having like complaint procedures and things in place to support me, clients, and so on. And also to have this, I want to say, this open-mindedness about how to work creatively, which I think is also extremely important. And today I am part of a board of a humanistic psychology organization in the UK where I trained, um, where I take an active role as a registrar. But I think it shows my my value for ethics, and how I lend
Mhm.
my time to also support that these things are in place.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing. I like that the idea about the co-creation between the therapist and the client, and that shows in the container that you create from the beginning, and it
Mm.
shifts as well, and the constant communication of how the container changes. And of course, mutual agreement, and that in itself is quite solid, quite explicit relational changes within the practice and the between the client and you. That's
Yeah.
wow.
And then I think there's one more thing that comes up as you're talking, which I'm suddenly remembering, which is one of the things that I will also say to clients is that I think it's very important for them to understand that there's a beginning, middle, and end to therapy,
Mm.
and that they will know, or they will feel, when they're in the beginning, in the middle, working on stuff more actively, and when they're coming to the end of a cycle, when they might need to leave because they've ended their work, or they might want to reopen another cycle, which is also fine. So there are stages, in essence, to the work. And by way of saying that, I then add that, of course, as part of the two-way process, that they can come in very freely, give me feedback, and I will give them my observations, of course, and that it really becomes a sort of two-way street, and that we will build in some time to reflect on the work, because
Wow.
it's very important nowadays to be in the zero zone and not always come with material, so that you can reflect. what's actually going on.
Like an empty container to kind of like see what fills in or what comes up. Brilliant. And on that note, I think it's a perfect segue as you talk about prepping clients to understand where's the start, the middle, and the end. They are the litmus tests in that way. But as you are working with them as well, what kind of changes do you tend to observe that shifts in the work, and what are your sort of like goalposts to where's the start, middle, end? I'm sure that's a bit different for you versus the clients.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how to answer that question. So, so how do we measure change actually in
Mm,
Gestalt therapy is an important question because we don't measure it with checklist type things. So the first thing that we need to ask a client is what do they hope to gain from the process? Okay. And that can change, of course, as we go. But I think that it's important to take into account what the client came to do, because even if they have a particular set of things that they present with, you might think it's a good idea for them to do X and Y, but they really want to do Z. So I think it's quite important to figure out what the answer to that question is, and
mm,
then to keep coming back to what what we're actually working on, and the client is the guide in some ways, and so we grow with that. But that's kind of number one. And then number two, I think there's a constant phenomenological sort of like checking in and a raising awareness of where the client is and where we are in the relationship and how we configure in a wider world, which leads us to understand better what the shifts are in the client, actually.
mm.
And sometimes that will take reflecting on, oh, I'm noticing that we're bantering between us. What's going on with us? And it feels a bit different than what it was in the beginning of the sessions. Do you remember 10 sessions ago? So that we can sometimes look at the changes from a relational perspective, or sometimes we can look at the changes from a more individual in the environment kind of perspective, or I want to put or three dots because, the possibilities are infinite.
Amazing.
So I would say that's the way that we measure change. We're not working towards symptom change
Mhm.
necessarily, but we're working towards deeper change.
Yeah, from what I understand, Gestalt therapy has a different way of seeing labels and symptoms and diagnosis as well. And these words mean differently to different
Yeah,
modalities as well. So I think that
absolutely.
really condenses the philosophy of the practice. How has your approach to counseling evolved over the years, considering recent big shifts since COVID and then post-COVID, shifting political climate, and now we're facing an AI generation? I have an AI companion with me in the room today. How does that shift the way that you have evolved in your practice?
Hmm. I think it's inevitable to have to encounter these things as therapists, because we do, and we meet clients that are also confronted and we're confronted, and so it's inevitable to have these figures in the practice room. And I think that these different stages brought about different consequences, if you will. During COVID, it was kind of a little bit strange because my family was home, but I was in the practice because the government supported mental health practitioners to come and work. So it was kind of an interesting, during work hours, I was at work. And what I noticed in during COVID is that although I'm super proud of like how Singapore managed this whole phase, I felt protected. I think they did well for their population. I'm really in admiration of it. I also think it brought about a lot of fragmentation, which is kind of like people were feeling more isolated, watching each other.
Mm,
There was a lot of this surveillance going
mhm,
on. And I think that those were difficult issues. And also, people were stuck together at home, and that brought about a lot of relational
mm,
suffocation as well as fragmentation, like
mm,
disconnection from others, but also suffocation in some ways from being one on top of each other. And often parents having to school their kids at home and couples really struggling with each other because it's the first time we get to spend so much time together. So I think that it brought this kind of like disconnection, you know. So I want to say that about COVID undermined our social and communal belonging, and then political climate. Yeah, I mean, political climate is super complicated right now. And because Singapore is so diverse, I sort of think that, again, there's a plethora of different ways of dealing with everything that's going on in the world. How to deal with grief and loss is very big. I think,
mm,
a lot of people feeling a lot of this helplessness, grief and loss. It's translating almost like trickling down to, the individual, the families, the work situation, and so on. And so I think there's uncertainty about how the world's evolving. We all have access to what's going on in the world,
mm.
which brings with it a responsibility. And I also see this kind of helplessness around what kind of responsibility to have, you know.
Thank you. And I also imagine the kind of grief changes as well because it's more complex grief where it's systemic and it's the helplessness and powerlessness as individuals becomes a lot more viscous, for lack of a better word. Like it's there and it's unable to flow. And how does it affect your practice? How does it change the way you show up in the room in your practice?
Well, it just means that there's a lot more to hold because to my
Mm,
mind, there's a lot to hold in the field, you know. So,
mm,
so there's a lot of complex feeling to hold as the world changes.
mm,
And I think that I then sense that I'm experiencing bits of the change through the different interactions I'm having with clients. So I'll give you an example.
mhm,
Like I sense that maybe there's some loosening of the boundaries around how to relate to each other and sort of like immorality sort of seeping in, you know and I think it's not just because of wars and stuff, although that too, but I also think it's because of the screen
mm,
usage and social media and all this and how we relate to each other online. And so I see it seeping into, say, how people are dealing with each other in larger corporations, I want to say.
mm.
and and this cutting people off or cutting off their jobs and making them redundant, the way it's done is completely different from
Oh,
how it
I see.
was 10, 20 years ago. And I think it's because there is like a merging of morals. What we can do online becomes perhaps a little bit more acceptable in how we relate to each other, face to face. And,
Wow.
maybe we can break a few more, I don't know, relational rules or something like this. And it creates really this kind of like relational atrophy.
Mm,
And I think that a lot of people are suffering from that, either because they're doing it themselves without awareness or because they're partaking, of course, and maybe I am too, who knows. And then the other side is they're suffering from someone doing it to them, you
mm,
know. And so there's a lot of grief around that,
mm.
a lot of it.
And yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. It became really, really big in my mind.
I find it sometimes quite harrowing and very sad.
Mhm. And I actually got reminded of Gestalt therapies. One of the practices is horizontalism, this idea of keeping everything like sort of on the same plane and each one equally has the same weight. And I think what you just described, the plethora of possible things that could be happening to your client at any point in time is now multiplied with all of these very new and very potent current affairs. and also like from COVID as well. How do you feel about that when I say it? Does that strike something with you with
Uh,
horizontalism?
I'm not sure that it does
Mm.
necessarily. I'm trying to think a little bit about what I think about that. The way I can relate is that I I think therapy will become more and more important as we go forward, and there is more verticalism, if you like to
Oh,
think of it that
oh,
way. And I think therapy really offers a space that is very unique because it allows for what you're saying, which is which is
mhm.
probably to do with some of the meeting and the contact, the real
Ah,
contact, not this kind of like way in which we escape contact because we go to a screen,
mm,
not this way that we sometimes cut the contact and then
right.
we feel bereft. So I sort of feel like in therapy, there's this opportunity. And today, I think it's really precious.
Mm. That's brilliant. Thank you for clarifying that as well. Julie, you trained in psychology and psychotherapy in the UK. I
Yeah.
imagine after moving to Singapore, about 13 years ago, was it? There was a shift in cultural context and client demographics as well. How was that
Yeah.
experience like for you?
It's been fascinating, a real cultural adventure in Singapore. I mean, people are from here, of course, but often not originally from here because a lot of people immigrated. And so it's been a very, very diverse practice. You know, I will often have to sort of still read up on different cultures, how people might think as part of a certain culture, as part of a certain people, or as part of a certain religion, and so on, located within a particular country, because that can vary, of course. And so it's been great, but it's also been mind-boggling and, time consuming and all this, because it's almost like no two people are the same in any case in therapy. But I really think that Singapore is very diverse. And so in my practice, I will say that I have 50% of people who are local, but local means different things because there are four different languages and ethnicity existed in Singapore. And so you have the Chinese, the Malay, the Indian, Tamil, and then you have the Eurasians, right? And so that doesn't include all the international community, of which I also see maybe spend 50% of my time with them. And they come from all sorts of different places in the world, as well as countries like neighboring countries in Asia. And so there'll be at any one time a lot of Indonesian clients, a lot of Thai clients, and it's fascinating, really. Yeah. And Western clients, of course, too, from Europe and so on. It makes for exciting work. And so I like the way I think my practice today is open to a lot of different issues and also open to a lot of different cultures.
It's interesting when you mentioned about different languages as well, with your background in psycholinguistics. The way that people approach each other on a daily basis is different, but it means the same sort of contact that you may encounter in Western cultures. That's
Absolutely, yes. Because if I meet a Singaporean, they might walk in and ask me, and you know this probably, but they might ask me, "Have you eaten today?" or "Have you eaten this evening?" And it's just a way to say, "How are you?" And it's very caring, of course, because it's almost like asking how I'm doing through food. And in other cultures like my own, there might be a "How are you?" you know,
mm,
as a question. So these things are very different and I think worth kind of picking up and noting and knowing about.
that's brilliant. Thank you. And over the 10 years, have there been perceivable shifts in the difficulties that people bring into therapy and people look for you to
Mm.
guide them in the practice?
So I definitely think that there have been phases. Like I said before, there were phases in the practice where different people or from different demographics would come in
Mhm.
for a particular kind of work that they wanted to do based on specialities. Today there's a mix of different issues, but I think at the core there's a lot of couple work because there's a lot of word of mouth here. So actually, I haven't necessarily advertised my practice as much. I have a website, but mainly the way things have worked up until now was through word of mouth. Someone experiences something in the couple work, and then if there's someone else in their community, they will just forward my name on. And it's a bit like that right now. And so I want to say couple work is probably more frequent. And what I notice in the couple work is that people are taking risks to bring down the polite wall, you know, a lot of this, like, how are we a perfect couple in the face of the world, but is it actually functioning? Is it working between us? Are we not just a functional couple, but more than that? I want more than that. So I think that maybe I need to say that I'm very interested in midlife because it's obviously my age. So I'm interested in, what do people want in midlife? And I'm interested in couples that are experiencing that too, that are taking the courage to actually speak up in their marriages and kind of like work at it, basically, depending on where they're at. Then I want to say that there's a sort of different set of issues that I see in more of the Singaporean based couples or individuals, and maybe talk a little bit about couples. I see people sort of like wanting to explore their own opinions and thoughts and ideas and how they feel about filial piety, for instance.
Mm.
How to be filial in their families is very important. And then sometimes it clashes with new values, and so they're trying to work that out. What's, I think, very common is to see adult children living with their families, which is a little bit more uncommon in Western culture. When you reach a certain age, you leave, sort of thing. I see people sort of like wanting to have deeper conversations with their
Mm.
families, which I really encourage. So I think it's lovely to see that people want more authenticity. And then I think people are also talking a little bit about practices such as disciplining and parenting,
Mm.
and sort of maybe the way that they're encouraged to marry early, to be able to, for instance, get that first apartment, that is really challenging them at the core, because they maybe have to make very early decisions that don't suit them a little bit further down the line. And so it's almost like a question of maturity. Are we allowed to mature as we go
Mm.
and figure this bit out organically
Mm.
as we go? And, in Gestalt therapy, we talk about the individual being an organism, environment, field.
Mm.
And it means really that we need to also organically live in this and meet requirements, but also make sure that the requirements that we are meeting is also an opportunity to meet with ourselves and see what we actually think about them and how we want to position ourselves in relation to them.
It hit quite a deep chord with me growing up as a Singaporean with the idea of the built to order flats and the narrative that we grew up with, and the idea that you can only get a house if you're 35 and you're single, and anything below 35 you have to get married. And you've touched on this a little bit as you were talking about the previous question of how some clients may be willing or less willing to talk about some things. So some clients are more willing to talk about what they want, what they need in relationships. Are there a lot more other themes that clients seem to be willing or less willing to talk about today?
Or less willing. I'm trying to think a little bit about what. So I definitely think that there is a deeper understanding today about mental health in general after COVID. So maybe that's one of the good
Mm.
spin-offs of COVID. And there is an openness about family of origin type work. So unfinished business,
Mm.
family-based work. I think people are more willing probably to open up about some of these things. And these things can sometimes be big, because if you're from a culture that has discipline at the heart of its way of raising children, there can be quite heavy, it can be heavy there. But what
Mm.
I'm finding is that people are more inclined to want to process and maybe not to repeat, which is interesting because I also see young parents, maybe even a bit older parents, who feel challenged and they just want to work on that. And so that's kind of lovely, I think. Yeah. So that's kind of one aspect. And then I think that people are maybe talking about addictions a little bit more readily, you know, be it like what I call screen binging
Mm,
type addiction, or even sexual addictions, because with everything that's available online, of course
mm,
there's like a whole world that's available online in that way too. So everything is becoming so much more accessible, I
mm.
want to say, and it leads to interesting places, which is complicated. It
It
makes for a
is.
lot of complications. Yeah.
Mm, I can
So
imagine.
did I answer that question?
Yes, of course. I feel really quite, while we're talking about these new persistent themes that are coming up that will probably not go away in the next 10 years, it might exacerbate even. The good thing that I find is that there are avenues for people to seek help in if they do find that it's affecting their functionality, and to kind of chat about where this addiction is going or have a place for conversation. So while I'm a little
Exactly.
bit like it's,
Exactly, because
yeah.
one of the things that is most traumatic is to be alone.
Mm,
To be alone with something that is happening and not know where to turn. The loneliness of that is really terrible. There's a lovely paper by Franceschetti who talks exactly about the pandemic of loneliness. It is loneliness that is at the heart of trauma, not what actually happens to you, but to be alone with it is what is traumatic. And so,
loneliness.
and of
Mm,
course, as like a disclaimer, I want to say that there's a lot of good stuff that comes with being online and being on screens. And also, it's here to stay. It's not going to go. It's just that it's kind of poorly regulated.
mm.
We are also poor at managing how we interact with these different modalities.
We're still having the reptilian side of our brains governing our more transcendent work online, which is
Yes.
really quite a weird contrast to think about.
I really like the way you put that. Yes.
Thank you. And on that note, I imagine that you have to hold a lot more in the therapy space, more than before, with the loneliness and with AI. How does that interact with your work now? Do you have to hold more now in your work?
I definitely think that at any one time therapists hold the space, hold the field, hold
Mm,
a lot, you know, uh, hold the door open is
mm,
what I'm thinking as soon as we open
mm,
the door, you know, that kind of thing. I'm thinking about how kindly you're opening the door or holding the door for me today. And so definitely, I think that one of the things that I'm holding in the background is a lot of uncertainty
mm,
and all the anxiety that comes with that. The uncertainty in the world, the uncertainty about, like, I have three daughters, in which world are they going to live? Is a question that I think many parents have today. So, and what's the world we're living in is the other question. And how do we engage with it? Because I think right now what's very common is to see a lot of this desensitization,
mm,
deflection, like avoidance, basically. And I think while all these things are happening at a bigger scale in our lives, there's still a way to appreciate how we're interacting with each other in our units,
mm,
and we all have to tend to our gardens in a way. But I would say that one of the things that I hold is probably this anxiety that comes with uncertainty, and and the something to do with the avoidance and how hard it is to work to come back,
mm,
how hard it is within myself to work at coming back, and how hard, and to focus. We have all these distractions nowadays, so it's challenging to focus. And when
Mm.
clients sort of take me through things and they're sort of like unfocused because it happens in our everyday lives today, it's hard to come back.
And I like the idea about tending the garden that you mentioned. And
Mm.
that leads me to my next question. How would you advise younger or newer therapists to tend to their gardens while sustaining themselves in this work?
It's a big question. And I like Thich Nhat Hanh for all his metaphors around
Mm.
gardening and mindfulness and cultivating solidity and all this kind of thing through putting your fingers in the earth and things like that to support yourself. So it's such a complex question. I thought about it. It's a lot. And outside of saying figure out a way to engage in the world that is playful and what and bodily and all, and that is grounding. I also think that today it's important to go for the things that you believe in. And how do you know about that? You will only know about that if you spend time in the zero zone. And the zero zone is the point of creative indifference, the fertile void, whatever we want to call it. And when you're there to process more deeply and to ask yourself important questions. And so, that becomes a little bit of a discipline, really. You got to be disciplined around that, I think. And so I think that that's important. It's important to stop, think, and
I
understand what's important to you in your practice, and then
mm,
go for it. You know,
I like the kind of contrast in your answer where you talk about the playfulness, but at the same time to be disciplined with the playfulness. So I think there's like a scale there that we're going to be traversing. And I really enjoy that visualization, at least in my head. Right. And I'm very aware of the time right now. I'm just wondering, just coming back to you, what currently feels alive and meaningful or important today in your practice?
right now, I want to say time flies when you're having fun.
Oh, I completely agree. I'm like, oh my God, we're running out of time.
And I suppose since young, I've been pursuing something that has to do with having meaning, processing more deeply, making the meaning as we go, something like that. And so I mean, that has always been important, and hence the name of my practice.
Mm.
But also I am in the beginning of a new project, and I'm thinking a lot about teaching right now, because I would like to be able to teach a little bit more of Gestalt therapy. So I would also say that to new therapists, come and train. When I manage to sort of like become active around this, and so I'm thinking a lot about like what's important in teaching, and discussing it with, some people that are my seniors and loving their input, because I think supervision is very important no matter what age and what stage you're at. And I think that paying tribute to roots is important. So it's good to think you know everything, but it's also good to go back to the roots. And I think when I think of teaching, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about who came before me, what's important to relate about. And when I think about how Gestalt therapy came about, it is a spin-off from psychoanalysis. And so right now I'm sort of steeped into looking at who came before the power couple, the Pearls et al., and the other people that contributed to the Gestalt therapy more directly, and excited about that.
I feel really excited and I really wish you the best in these endeavors.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, and it reminds me of this Chinese, I think it's an idiom. It's called 饮水思源, which is when you drink the water, you think about the origin of where that water is. So I think that really links quite deeply for me. That came up for me. Thank you so much for that.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you too, Iffa.
Julie, we have come to the end of our interview. We really appreciate you taking the time today to be in conversation with Voices of Practice, sharing about your practice, and sharing your insights on the trends in Singapore. It's extremely invaluable. And of course, your hopes for our local counseling and psychotherapy scene. I'm very excited for what the future holds, despite all the big, ambiguous, and uncertain things that are happening. We look forward
Mhm.
to continually engage the community, including you, to support the network and gain the transparency around the field of mental health in Singapore. So thank you once again for being here, Julie.
Yeah, thanks for including me and having me, Iffa. I'm excited about your project. Really, I am. So if there's anything more I can do, I'd love to support.
Thank you. Have a good day, Julie.
Thanks.